I'm Tim Ventura from AmericanAntigravity.com, and I'm speaking with Dr. Stephen Greer, ER trauma physician and former chairman of the Department of Emergency Medicine at Caldwell Memorial Hospital. However, you probably know him better as the founder of both the Disclosure Project and Space Energy Access Systems, which have provided a ray of hope for millions of alt-science fans around the globe and brought the serious discussion of UFOs to the United States Congress. Both Disclosure and SEAS are exemplary organizations. Disclosure has assembled a dream team of expertise to provide unparalleled, credible commentary on the truth behind the UFO phenomena, and SEAS Power has assembled a cadre of investors to work on finding and funding the next big step in breakthrough energy technology. Well, let's start out with what I believe is one of your greatest achievements with the Disclosure Project, overcoming the giggle factor to build a solid collaboration spanning government, industry, and the body politic. My impression is that in an era of divisiveness, you've managed to build bridges to accomplish something unique. What are your current goals, and how is your work progressing?
We're putting out everything we can with the resources we have. Of course, this is a completely volunteer effort, and we've really been restricted mainly because of lack of staff and funding. But at this point, we have a really strong presence in Washington with a network of people who follow what we're doing, and I know for a fact that there are many people who are waiting for the next phase of what we're hoping to do, and that's identify a legitimate energy or propulsion system that proves the physics behind what these objects are actually capable of doing. And that's, of course, what we're working on with our energy project.
Well, one of the things that I noticed while doing research, I guess, for the interview was how many belief systems there are. I guess the thought that came to mind was, back in something like 1950, the public perception of UFOs was pretty homogeneous. But, now in 2005, we have a multitude of diverging belief systems about ET. The rumors include psychic aliens, aliens working at Area 51, aliens the Bermuda Triangle, hybrids, and,
Well, it goes on. Well, the whole problem is that what we've tried to do is avoid all of that and go to people who've actually been in government circles who worked on these projects and say, okay, look, here's what there is a consensus reality for, and then you can get into these other things if you really want to start counting angels on the head of the tent. I view 90% of what's out there as speculative and nonsense, quite frankly, and of course some people don't like to hear that, but what we're trying to focus on is what are people who have actually been in positions where they've been up close and dealing with the technology or programs dealing with the so-called UFOs. What have they seen? What is the intent apparently behind the actions that have been observed? For example, we have, when I started putting this together, I said, I can't do this with just one or two people. We need to have dozens of people. And so when I started talking to people about the apparent UFO interest in, for lack of a better word, nuclear assets, including weapons facilities, nuclear launch facilities, storage areas, nuclear-based ships, I said, we need to find not just one or two, but maybe a dozen of these people who are military or intelligence people who've dealt with this. And that's what we did. People like Colonel Diedrichson, who was with the Atomic Energy Commission, the old AEC before it was the DOE, and who had said that it corroborated what other accounts that we had gotten from other people who had top-secret clearances, and which we'd also found from our colleagues in the Soviet Union, that apparently, while there's, I still maintain there's no evidence that these things are at all hostile, but they were obviously very concerned about our hostility, and so I turned the whole argument on its head. There are all these, speculations about different ET civilizations and why they're here, and I'm going, well, I think it's actually much simpler than people have made out. And you look at the progression of our civilization since the last 100 years, and we've gone from essentially a agrarian society with horse and buggies to thermonuclear weapons, including the hydrogen bomb, and going out into space with them. So this is something that obviously would get the attention of any civilization or group of civilizations that may have been involved watching our evolution for all these years. And I think that, some people say, well, there's an ancient connection to this. And very well maybe. It could be that we've been observed for thousands of years. But what we can prove today is that there have been very advanced man-made spacecraft or aircraft that are being made by a consortium of companies such as Lockheed and SAIC and Northrop, and what is actually of extraterrestrial origin. It's called the NSA ETVs, extraterrestrial vehicles, which is the term used there. So I think that what we have to do is then look at the fact that we have had since at least the 50s very advanced so-called anti-gravity or electrogravitic, magnetogravitic systems that we've been experimenting with that have been up and flying. In fact, I have a photograph of one flying over Provo, Utah from 1964, and it's certainly no doubt in my mind that we have been doing some experimental research with these types of energy and propulsion systems in sort of deep black, very classified projects. So you get into another problem here, and that is the public, how much of what they're seeing is man-made and how much of it's extraterrestrial, and most people don't realize that there is even as Nick Cook has began to explore since the 50s, and perhaps earlier, a very well-funded, classified aerospace program that was dealing with exactly this kind of anti-gravity technology. So you at a certain point have to put a matrix together, as it were, that looks at this entire spectrum of possibilities that include man-made and extraterrestrial. Now, when you're dealing with the extraterrestrial, I don't see there's any evidence for a lot of the theories that are out there that, hey, they're coming here to eat us for lunch and snatching our babies out of our wombs and have them floating around Alpha Centauri and incubators, and it goes on ad nauseum. What we've done with the Disclosure Project, if people go to our website, disclosureproject.org, is to put people who have actually been up close and personal with this, whether they're air traffic controllers or people who've worked in corporate circles or people who've worked for the various intelligence agencies, and what they've seen and what they've observed, and make it real. And the speculation just goes on forever. And quite frankly, I have to tell you, Tim, I think a lot of the speculation that's out there is seeded by disinformation agents who want the silly season, I hate to use that term, but the silly season of ufology to be the dominant thing that is seen. And in fact, I think that is the case. I think that if you look at what's out there in videos and on television and in movies, it's the disinformation and nonsense that predominates, and it's very, very hard with all that noise to pick up a signal. What we're trying to do is give a signal out there that's clear and that can be substantiated, not like the New York Times does with 3 sources, but with several hundred sources. And the irony of this, of course, is that big media usually won't cover this subject, and even though they'll go on about other speculative things in Washington, being in Washington a lot, you kind of see this culture evolve. And yet what we've done is put together a tremendous network of military intelligence corporate people who've seen this up close and know what the truth is about this, and have corroborating people. And I tell people that that's what you have to do. You can't have one radar operator who says, I tracked one of these things going 10,000 miles per hour that made a right-hand turn over wherever, Montreal. You need to have a dozen of them, and that's what we did. And then you need to get the radar tapes, and then you need to get the documentation. And so that's what the Disclosure Project has. A lot of people says, well, if that's been put together, why doesn't the whole world know this? I said, well, this gets into a larger discussion of the national security state and the corruption of big media. But it has nothing to do with what evidence is there. The evidence is overwhelming and very clear.
Sure. Well, speaking of events, I guess, in terms of, you mentioned the radar operator, I had an experience in 1994 with a giant black triangle larger than a football field that passed so close overhead that I could count rivets on the hull. Now, in my case, I don't have an explanation for it, but it really did change my perspective. And I'm wondering, in your case, if there was a singular event like this that really shook your worldview, leading down the path that you're now taking.
Well, yeah, a couple things converged when I was a child. My uncle was the senior project engineer for the lunar module. The Grumman built the lunar module that took Neil Armstrong to the moon, and he was my uncle, my mother's oldest brother. And what was interesting is that around that same time, when he was working on that, I guess I was 8 or 9 years old, living in Charlotte, North Carolina, and they had a Douglas missile plant, as it turned out, not too far from where I live. And I saw in broad daylight, a silvery, sort of oval-shaped craft. It was daytime, late afternoon, and me and some of the boys in the neighborhood saw this thing, daytime sighting, silent, had made no noise, and then it just vanished. It didn't move off. It just disappeared. Now, of course, my family said, "Oh, yes, well, it's the active imagination of a child." But even an 8 or 9-year-old boy, when you see something like this, you know what you've seen, and so it ignited a lifelong interest in this subject, and that's really how I got interested. In fact, I was a little bit like Richard Dreyfuss in the Close Encounters of the Third Kind. I collected every magazine and book I could as a little 8, 9, 10-year-old boy on this subject, and read everything I could and got every photograph I could. I was just absolutely enthralled with the whole idea of it, and so that's really how my interest began.
Well, and it makes sense. I think when you're really following your passion, it leads to the kind of success you've had with disclosure. It's that natural progression from being so passionate about seeing an idea through and finding the truth for yourself that I think people inherently believe in your goals and believe in the way you're approaching it. I've noticed that there's some overlap between UFOs and I guess the research that I'm doing into anti-gravity technology. And I think part of that is most people take it for granted that UFOs use a type of advanced propulsion, and then they further assume that this involves gravity control. And I guess what I'm wondering is, with the multitude of stories out there with diverging claims, do you have any thoughts on kind of the best avenues for research?
Well, to be honest with you, I think you have to really go all the way back to some of the early work of Tesla. You have to go back to some of the work that T. Townsend Brown and the B-Field-Brown effect, as it was called. And, of course, that work went black in the early 50s. I have an Office of Naval Research document. I'm not sure if you have this document, Tim, but you should, that discusses the Townsend work and what the Office of Naval Research had found and studying what he was doing. Now, you have to understand that there's a merging of breakthroughs that were going on since the 20s, 30s, and 40s with human scientists. And the sort of potentiation of that research that then happened in the late 40s and 50s with the retrieval, and this did occur, of extraterrestrial vehicles, which they did not come to Earth and just crash because they didn't know how to fly around in our atmosphere. Very high-powered electromagnetic radar arrays were used to interfere with the guidance and electronics of these things, and 2 of them did crash initially, and we know that there have been several others. I have a top-secret guy who's worked at Fort Huachuca for Army intelligence, and there's an underground base there, facility, not right at Fort Huachuca, but attached to it, and that's all I'll say, where he has seen 9 separate extraterrestrial vehicles that are in storage there, and a number of extraterrestrial bodies, and some of those date back, way back to the middle of the last century, the mid-20th century. Now, what that means is that, as I'm sure you have seen a memo from Canada from 1951, where it's describing the fact that a group headed up by Dr. Vannevar Bush was studying the modus operandi, I'm quoting here, of the UFOs that had been retrieved. And this is an uncontested top-secret document from Canada that accidentally got declassified in the 70s. We have it. And it's interesting because it talks about this project that was studying the propulsion and how these so-called UFOs operated. They were called flying saucers back then, to be honest with you. And these extraterrestrial vehicles were being studied, and a very, very high-profile team, although very clandestine work, was being done, headed up by Dr. Vannevar Bush, who also headed up, by the way, the Manhattan Project, and a lot of the work with the development of the atomic weapons. Now, in this top-secret document, it clearly states that the secrecy surrounding that project of studying how the UFOs are operating is more tightly held than the development of the hydrogen bomb. Now, the reason that's significant is that the hydrogen bomb had not been detonated at the time that this memo was written. And so this top-secret memo, and there are others like them that we've accumulated. We have over 5,000 pages of government documents from the U.S., Canada, the old KGB files, Spain, all over the world, Great Britain. And it's a very interesting thing. Most people say, well, where's the smoking gun in it? I said, well, we have thousands of smoking guns. Which one do you want to look at? And it's interesting because, but historically, what you need to do is then understand that the early work that had been done by some scientists like T. Townsend Brown and Dr. Beefield and others was merged in very classified projects, and mainly in the aerospace industry. Lockheed Skunk Works, Northrop, later SAIC got involved with these things. bad news, in a sense. The good news is that we have figured out a lot of this. The bad news is that the group that's managing the secrecy around this has pretty much walked away from the interest of we the people, and this is where it gets into a very social and political crisis. Just as Eisenhower had warned us, beware the military-industrial complex, and he wasn't referring so much to his colleagues in the military, he was a five-star general and a conservative Republican, as the corporate kleptocracy that was going to get the funding and the classification to run with this stuff and hide it. We have one of his witnesses, Brigadier General Steve Lubkin, who was a young aide working with Eisenhower directly in the White House and witnessed how Eisenhower had been, quote, stabbed in the back and had been betrayed by those interests that he later warned us about on his last swan song speech to the nation in 1961 when he left office. So I think people have to understand that there are extremely well-developed prototypes and craft that are out there, many of which have been seen by people like you and others, that are man-made and that are, if you will, anti-gravity or electrogravitic, and that deal with propulsion, dealing with the neutralization of mass inertia. There's two things here. I don't want to get too technical, but mass inertia and gravity, and they're not necessarily the same, as you know.
Yeah.
You have mass inertia out in deep space where there's virtually no gravitational pull. But these technologies cancel that, essentially. So an object can appear to float, or it can be moving at an enormous speed and make a right-hand turn without the occupants feeling it, because it can be adjusted internally for those so-called G-forces are controlled. The other thing is that they can appear to disappear. Now this gets into a little stranger, because if you take these physics a little further, you can do, and this sounds like Star Trek, where you actually, quote, dematerialize an object. And what that means is that the resonance phase of it has shifted so that it is no longer in a frequency at the speed of light. And it just disappears. So you'll have an object there, and then it'll phase, and boom, it's gone. And we have many, many accounts of this, both on radar, but very well-trained observers who've seen this. And our advanced research team that's gone out all over the world to study this have seen this happen many times out in the field and throughout the United States and Latin America and England and Belgium and other locations.
Well, one thing that I've been wondering about, actually, this is I guess it's a little bit of a tangent from the questions I'd written for myself, but I had a discussion with a few friends. We were talking about, the topic of UFOs, and one of the questions that came up was, why are they here now? And the only idea that we could think of, and I think this touches back to your comments about it being more secret than the bomb, was the detonation of nuclear bombs and then subsequent testing in 45 through the 50s.
Well, I have had one top secret military, and I mean, these are people with Q clearances and north of Q clearance, if you get my drift, folks who have told me absolutely that's the case. I've had British intelligence and Ministry of Defense people tell me the same thing in Great Britain, that the big surge in interest in humanity, whether or not there's an ancient connection, whether or not the Nazca lines, and whether or not there's some cave drawings from France that date back thousands of years of what purport to be UFOs. It's harder to prove that because you're going so far back in time, and the history and the record is not good. But what we have in the modern era is clearly a huge resurgence of interest in Earth and I think the human race at the time that we developed weapons of mass destruction and began to explore space. But remember, those two events were on a very parallel track, that our ability to detonate nuclear weapons in the 40s and 50s was also the beginning of the space era, of course, which my family was involved with. And what you find is that the combination of those two things, logically, and I hate to sound like Spock here, but I mean, just look at this logically and dispassionately from the eyes of a civilization, not human, but out in space, watching us develop. All of a sudden, you have this murderous civilization that's killed tens of millions of our own people in warfare, developing weapons that can destroy entire planets, right? Okay, a few of them can destroy an entire planet.
Sure.
With thousands of them launched, aimed at each other in a policy of mutual assured destruction, and we're going out into space. Well, I mean, you'd have to be galactically brain dead not to take notice of this and be concerned. And I believe that, yes, this is really what triggered it. And it isn't because they are hostile towards us, concerned with our hostility. And what I've found is that in all likelihood, if we were to ever to figure out how to live peacefully on this planet, and I should add, go out into space peacefully as opposed to competing nations with our weapons in tow, I believe that we would find a very welcome, an open-to-armed response. However, I think so long as we remain on a war footing, and where the military-industrial complex is controlling the agenda in space and also controlling the agenda on Earth, I think that you're going to find a more cautious approach to the human situation. And I think this makes sense because, frankly, our technology has outstripped our social and spiritual development in a way that at this stage is very dangerous, because we're not dealing with muskets and rifles and things like this. We're dealing with weapon systems that even go beyond nuclear, by the way, into the so-called scalar systems that can be a threat to other civilizations. And I think that this is why one of the biggest challenges, and I say this to people when I gave a lecture at the United Nations, and Mrs. Boutros-Ghali had invited me to come there, the wife of the Secretary General, and a whole lot of high-profile people were at this meeting. I said, the title of the talk was The Foundations of Interplanetary Peace, and this was the topic of the discussion, that while there was no evidence at all that these civilizations of extraterrestrial origin are hostile towards us, they're very concerned with our ability to destroy ourselves and perhaps also to destroy other worlds, and that we are going to have to evolve past that sort of, shall I say, a backward way of behavior before we're going to be welcomed too far out in space. And I do honestly believe that we have had our, I hate to use the word quarantine, but to a certain extent I think our ability to go out into space, even with some of these advanced technologies we've developed in classified projects, is limited because they know that we're not socially, spiritually, or otherwise psychologically mature enough to do this without trying to go out there in a way that could be a threat to other civilizations.
Oh yeah.
And I think that this makes sense, and I do believe that that's why the 40s, 50s, and forward were so prominent in terms of people seeing UFOs, and they were very often seen around nuclear facilities.
Well, I'd like to quickly touch on some of the repeated claims, and I guess we could call these mythology, maybe. I don't know if there's truth or fiction to them.
Right. The urban myths, as they were.
Yeah, I think part of it has been that the entire thing has gone on for so long that it's all become part of our popular mythology, part of our popular vernacular. But in this case, bismuth and mercury pop up again and again, being involved with not only UFOs, but also all sorts of gravity research projects. And I haven't seen any hard and fast speculation other than supposedly bismuth acts like a condenser for gravitational effects, and then mercury is repeatedly cited in the Nazi Bell, Edgar Fouché's TR-3B, and even the ancient Vimana texts. I'm wondering if you've seen anything that might lend some idea as to why these keep popping back up.
Well, there are certain materials, and those are two that you mentioned that have been associated with, I think, some of the more primitive gravity wave or anti-gravity research. I think the more advanced ones deal with electronics that are not as dependent on those materials, if that makes any sense.
Oh, okay, so these are really kind of the baseline, and it's moved forward since then, but that probably hasn't leached back out into the mythology yet.
Right.
So,
Well, and the same thing with some of the energy research we've seen. We've seen people doing research on crystalline structures where a certain electronic signal goes into a crystalline structure, and the resonance of that crystal will then recruit energy from what's called the zero-point energy field, and more energy comes out than you're putting in. Now, people say, well, it violates the second law of thermodynamics. It doesn't, because there's a baseline energy that is if you will, the substrate or the base upon which all matter and all energy forms are fluxing in and out of the quantum vacuum, as it's been called. So, now I'm just a country doctor here in Virginia. I don't purport to be a physicist, but from what I understand, this is really where the real action has been.
Sure.
And I think these materials facilitated, and just like certain crystalline structures had facilitated the effect that you're describing in terms of gravity control manipulation and anti-gravity effect.
Well, another one also that I'd wanted to ask you about was I've talked a few times. Actually, I've spent several hours on the phone with Bob Lazar, and I guess
I've met him also.
Yeah, he's, at least in my case, he's refused to really talk about whatever his experiences might be at Area 51. But from what he said in public, I've always heard that the real technology, quote unquote, is supposedly kept at S4. I'm wondering if you could describe this a bit for us.
Well, this so-called Area 51, its heyday was the 60s, and this is a shock to people when they hear it. Its heydays were the 60s and maybe up into the 70s. It was a less important facility later. And today, it's not that there is nothing of importance there, but the real action is going on in areas of Utah. There's an underground facility up near the not too far from Provo, and also in the high desert, in the Edwards complex, and in a few other places in Australia, and a couple others that we've located where we have people who've been in those facilities. So, but yes, there have been historically very important research projects related to so-called UFOs, both the extraterrestrial origin, but also man-made systems that are, if you will, reverse engineering them, and also kind of bringing together basic human understanding with some of the materials and some of the metals and metallurgy and sciences that they've retrieved from extraterrestrial vehicles. And certainly this area in Nevada was an important area, but I think that its apex of importance was in the 60s and 70s.
Oh, okay. Well, I'd like to move on to a subject that I think is both close to both of our hearts, which is really discrimination. And I guess this not only happens, but it appears to be a sanctioned discrimination against UFOs, anti-gravity, ESP, and pretty much everything out there that falls outside of kind of the quote-unquote mainstream belief system. The phrase, "it's not real," is just as degrading as any racial slur, and I think it's especially hurtful when it costs researchers grants or even their jobs and families. And
well,
I'm wondering...
and this is what's sad about it, is that there's a hell of a lot more proof for the existence of this subject we're discussing today than for a black hole. No one's ever visited a black hole. It's only been detected by its perturbations and effects secondarily. Same thing with subatomic particles. Most people don't realize in physics, a lot of the things that are people hang their hats on have never been directly observed. I mean, we're talking about a subject where there are 3,500 landing trace cases where there's physical evidence, experimental evidence. At this point, 450 top-secret military witnesses who've seen this stuff up close and personal, who were cleared to carry nuclear weapons, for God's sakes, or even launch them, who are given testimony. Thousands of pages of uncontested government documents, and yet this giggle factor. And I will tell you that the people in the intelligence community I've spoken with have said the deliberate ridiculing and trashing of the subject is how they've contained it more than anything. That and the corruption of big media.
Well,
now, you have to understand that a lot of people who are put forward to come out to the public and say, "Oh, this is all nonsense," are on the payroll of the intelligence community. For example, back in the 60s, Donald Menzel was the guy to do that, a Harvard astronomer. "Oh, this is all nonsense." Well, I have a document naming him as one of their advisors on this.
Sure.
So he was taking money. He was presenting himself to the scientific community as a dispassionate scientist when he was a corrupt shill for this kleptocracy of covert programs, taking money through the back door through the agency. This is uncontested. It's a document I have, and he's named in it. And same thing with the Condon report that was done at the University of Colorado that debunked all this. Dr. Robert Wood, and also documents that I've acquired, proved for a fact that Dr. Condon, who presented himself as a dispassionate scientist, so I'm going to tell the truth about what UFOs really are, and then came out with this completely debunking whitewash report that ridiculed all of it, he was on the payroll of the agency, and I have a document naming him. So what you find is that you have people in academia, in corporations, and in government who present themselves as sterling scientists and legitimate people who will then go to the press or go to scientific gatherings and poo-poo all of this, but these people are utterly corrupt, and we can prove this. So this corruption is really the name of the game, and unfortunately, the masses don't get the benefit of what the truth is. Now, the flip side of that is that they've won some of those battles, but they've lost the war. And here's what I mean. More than half of America believe that there's something to these UFOs and that the government's hiding something or lying about it. And that's a consistent number. So more people think that this stuff is real than voted for any of the recent presidents, none of whom have really gotten over 50% of the electorate. So what you find is that they've tried to keep this contained, but they've contained it from not so much the masses, but they've tried to contain it from polite society, what you would call your prestigious scientific institutions and media. For example, the New York Times has a stated policy of redlining anything about UFOs. They will not report anything on it. Well, you have to ask why. Here the Disclosure Project puts together not 2 or 3 sources, but dozens of top secret insiders in government, and I'm sitting there briefing a sitting CIA director on this stuff, and the New York Times refuses to have one story about it. So you have to understand that the big media is the only thing in our society more corrupt than the big corporate and government world. The big media is the most corrupt institution in America.
Well, that's why I'm wondering if it might be helpful to pursue it as a civil rights issue in terms of, again, I mean, discrimination against people. We're not allowed to do it on the basis of race, gender, religion, or a variety of factors. And yet, if someone says, I believe in this event, I believe in this to be truthful, and they could get fired from their job, they could lose their family.
Well, yes, we have a pilot who's a 777 pilot for a major airline who was being threatened with being sat down because he was not only had seen one of these objects, but was involved with our project, and that actually almost went to litigation. And they backed down, of course, and he's still flying the 777. But you also remember the Japan Airlines event that happened over Alaska that we have top secret documents for. And John Callahan, who was head of the FAA, gave us the radar tape. He was head of the Accidents and Investigation section of the FAA, I should say. And he gave us the radar tapes for this event. Well, that pilot, the Japanese Airlines pilot who first reported this, was put down and not allowed to fly for a month or two until Dr. Richard Haynes at NASA, who I've worked with for years, who's collected many, over, a couple thousand of these pilot reports, went forward and went over to the Japanese government and to the airline and said, look, this man was not hallucinating. These things are real, and here's the evidence for it. So there have been some cases like that. It's interesting. They don't spill into the major media much, but I would say that anyone who has been denied a job or has been discriminated against because of their involvement of this should actually litigate it, because we would be happy to have our witnesses be read into oath. One of the things we're looking for is a venue so that all these top secret people we've identified can testify under oath. And if the Congress doesn't have the courage to do it, then a civil tort case could do it.
Oh, but, sure.
So I would say that anyone who's suffered something like that legitimately should pursue it.
Well, and speaking of involvement, I'd actually like to wrap up our interview with, I guess, the big question of how can people get involved, how they can contribute, and how they can get their friends and relatives the kind of solid information so that they can form an educated opinion about this topic.
Well, I think the best way is to start with educating yourself. Our website, disclosureproject.org, has video footage. People can see the 2-hour national press event that was covered on CNN and networks all over the world of these top secret military people speaking. We have a book called Disclosure that has almost 600 pages that has nearly 70 of these military and intelligence and corporate people testifying to what they had seen. We have a 2-hour and a 4-hour videotape of their testimony that's very thorough. And these are things that are openly available to the public. Anyone can get it from our website, disclosureproject.org, and they can refer their friends and colleagues and families to that. And I encourage them to. The other thing they can do is to help us identify more of these sort of whistleblowers and people who've worked in these settings, because we're always looking for new sources. We have an ongoing project to identify these sorts of witnesses. the other thing is that there are people out there who are aware of the technologies of energy or propulsion devices that perhaps they've worked on or tinkered with. And we have a separate corporate effort right now trying to develop a energy device, energy or propulsion device that proves the physics behind what people have observed. And so anyone who can help us with that, I would encourage them to contact us.
Okay, and that would be the SEAS Power website at seaspower.com, right?
Right.
Okay, so disclosureproject.org or seaspower.com. Well, thank you again for your time. I sincerely appreciate it. This has been a wonderful opportunity to cover kind of a unique subject matter with, the recognized expert in the field.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your help.
Thanks again.
All right. Bye-bye.